Have you ever seen a ghost on a map? A city that was there one day and gone the next. Not abandoned. Erased. Between 1939 and 1945, this happened again and again. Hundreds of cities across Europe and Asia were turned into rubble. We have the photographs, black and white images of bustling streets, grand cathedrals, and quiet neighborhoods. Then the aftershots. A sea of broken stone, twisted metal, a skyline of jagged teeth where buildings used to be. The numbers are hard to grasp. Some say 60 million people died, some say more. The physical destruction is just as staggering. In Germany alone, over 20 million people were left homeless. In London, the Blitz destroyed over 1 million homes. Warsaw was leveled, almost 85% of it gone. But here's the strange, unsettling question that follows. Did the war that destroyed the old world also build the new one? Did the bombs that fell from the sky clear the ground for the society we live in today? These photos aren't just about loss. They are the first page of the story of our modern age, a story written in ash and then rebuilt in concrete steel and a completely new set of rules. Was the 20th century's greatest tragedy, also its most powerful catalyst for change. Number 6, what does it mean to erase a city from the sky? Before the Second World War, war was mostly something that happened on a battlefield. Armies met in fields or trenches. Cities were captured, sometimes besieged, but the idea of systematically wiping one out from the air was new. It was a terrifying new kind of power. The photographs of cities like Dresden or Tokyo before the war show intricate, ancient places. Wooden houses packed tightly together, winding medieval streets, churches that had stood for 500 years. As they were living organisms, products of centuries of growth. The after photos show a different reality. They show what happens when that new power is unleashed. It's not just damage, it is annihilation. This was the result of a military doctrine that evolved during the war's strategic bombing, or in its cruder form, area bombing. The idea was no longer just to hit a factory or a railway line. The goal was to destroy the city itself. The logic, as cold as it was to break the will of the people, to destroy their homes, their workplaces, their morale, until they could no longer support the war effort. Think about the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, led by Arthur Harris. He was a proponent of this strategy. He believed that bombing German cities into rubble was the most effective way to shorten the war. The infamous raid on Hamburg in July 1943, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, was a terrifying proof of concept. The RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces dropped incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm. This is a phenomenon where the heat is so intense it creates its own weather system. Winds reached hurricane speeds and temperatures climbed to over 800 degrees Celsius. The air itself caught fire. People in air raid shelters didn't die from the bombs, they were baked alive or suffocated as the firestorm consumed all the oxygen. Around 40,000 people died in about a week. The city was a smoldering ruin. Then there was Dresden in February 1945. Dresden was a city of art and culture known as the Florence on the Elbe. It had limited strategic importance. But over 2 days, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. A firestorm engulfed the historic city center. The destruction was almost total. The famous Frauenkirche, the Grand Dome Church, held out for 2 days before its sandstone pillars glowed cherry red, and it collapsed in on itself. The number of dead is still debated, but it's in the tens of thousands. The writer Kurt Vonnegut was a prisoner of war in Dresden and survived the bombing by huddling in an underground meat locker. His experience formed the basis of his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. He described the aftermath as looking like the surface of the moon. The same logic was applied in the Pacific. The cities of Japan were largely made of wood and paper. This made them incredibly vulnerable to fire. General Curtis LeMay of the U.S. Army Air Forces abandoned high-altitude precision bombing for low-level, nighttime raids with incendiary bombs. The results were devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, was the single most destructive air raid in human history. In one night, a fleet of B-29 bombers burned 16 square miles of the city to the ground. An estimated 100,000 people were killed, and 1 million were left homeless. More people died that night in Tokyo than in the initial blast at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The after photos show an endless, flat expanse of charred debris, punctuated only by the occasional stone chimney or bank vault. This new kind of warfare changed everything. It removed the line between soldier and civilian. Your home was now the front line. The technology was a key part of it. The development of long-range heavy bombers like the Avro Lancaster and the Boeing B-29 meant that no city was safe. The invention of radar, navigation aids, and powerful new explosives made this destruction systematic and efficient. It was an industrial process. The photos of the ruins are not just images of destruction, they are images of a new, terrible capability that humanity had developed. The power to unmake a city, to turn centuries of history into dust and ash in a matter of hours. This capability did not disappear when the war ended. It became the foundation of the new global power structure, culminating in the atomic bombs that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki, proving that a single plane with a single bomb could now do what once took 1,000. The war's end left a world where cities were understood to be fragile, vulnerable things. This knowledge seeped into the consciousness of the post-war generation. It fueled the anxieties of the Cold War, the fear that what happened to Dresden or Tokyo could happen to New York or Moscow, but this time, in minutes. The sobering before and after pictures are a testament to a threshold that was crossed, a Rubicon of destruction from which there was no turning back. But we still don't know the full psychological impact on the air crews who carried out these orders night after night. What did it do to a generation of young men to rain fire on unseen people below? We also don't fully understand why some cities were chosen for total destruction while others were spared. Was it always purely military logic, or were other factors at play? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, having developed this capacity for total urban destruction, can we ever truly put it back in the box? Number 5. When the rubble clears, what do you build? The silence after the last bomb falls must be one of the strangest sounds in the world. For years, the soundtrack of life was sirens, explosions, and the drone of engines. Then, peace. But peace doesn't look peaceful, it looks like a wasteland. Imagine standing in the center of your city and seeing nothing but rubble in every direction. This was the reality for millions in 1945. The question they faced was monumental. What do you do now? Do you try to put the past back together exactly as it was? Or do you clear the slate and build something entirely new? The answers they chose fundamentally shaped the cities we know today. You can see two starkly different philosophies in the fates of Warsaw and Rotterdam. But Warsaw was a city marked for death. The occupying forces wanted to wipe it from the map, to destroy Polish culture and identity. After the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, what was left of the city was systematically demolished, block by block. By 1945, it was a ghost. The historical Old Town, with its beautiful merchant houses and royal castle, was gone. The decision made by the Polish people was an act of defiance. They decided to rebuild it, not just to build a new city, but to resurrect the old one. It was a painstaking, almost archaeological process. They used pre-war architectural plans. They used old photographs. Most remarkably, they relied on the highly detailed 18th century paintings of the city by the Italian artist Bernardo Bellotto, known as Canaletto. His paintings were so accurate they served as blueprints. Rubble was sifted to find original pieces of masonry and decoration. It took decades, but they rebuilt the old town to look exactly as it had before the war. It was a political and cultural statement. It said, "You cannot erase us. Our history is still here." In 1980, UNESCO declared Warsaw's rebuilt Old Town a World Heritage Site, not as an original, but as a symbol of near-total reconstruction. Rotterdam chose the opposite path. The heart of the Dutch port city was destroyed by an air raid in May 1940. The bombing lasted just 15 minutes, but it flattened the city center. After the war, the planners and architects looked at the flattened landscape not as a tragedy to be reversed, but as a unique opportunity. They embraced the future. They swept away the old street plans and the remnants of the past. In their place, they built a hyper-modern city. They were heavily influenced by the modernist architectural movement and the ideas of architects like Le Corbusier. The new Rotterdam would be a city of light, air, and space. It would be designed for the car. It featured wide boulevards, functional high-rise buildings, and a separation of living, working, and recreational zones. The result was a city that looked nothing like its pre-war self. It was a bold, forward-looking experiment in urban planning. It became a model for other destroyed cities that wanted to modernize. Most cities fell somewhere in between these two extremes. Look at Coventry in England. Its medieval cathedral was destroyed in a massive raid in November 1940. The event was so shocking it was said to have inspired a new German word, Coventryeren, meaning to annihilate a city. After the war, the city decided not to tear down the cathedral's surviving ruins. Instead, they preserved the skeletal remains of the old church as a memorial garden. Right next to it, they built a stunningly modern new cathedral designed by Basil Spence. The old and the new stand side by side. The ruin is a constant reminder of the cost of war, while the new building is a symbol of reconciliation and hope for the future. This approach of integrating the scars of the past into the fabric of the new city was a powerful one. This period was a golden age for urban planners and architects. The war had, in a brutal way, cleared the ground for their grand visions. The pre-war cities were often seen as cramped, unsanitary, and inefficient. The destruction offered a chance to fix these problems to build healthier, more rational cities. The ideas of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, a group of influential modernist architects, were suddenly very practical. Their vision of functional, zoned cities became the blueprint for reconstruction across Europe. The photos of these rebuilt cities often show a stark contrast with the before pictures. The organic, sometimes chaotic density of the old city is replaced with clean lines, open spaces, and concrete towers. This was the birth of the modern urban landscape that many of us now take for granted. But it was a landscape born directly from the ashes of the old one. But what did we lose in this rush to modernize? How many quiet, unique neighborhoods were swept away in favor of efficient, but perhaps soulless, housing blocks? We don't fully know the social consequences of raising old communities and replacing them with modernist designs. Did these new cities foster the same sense of belonging as the old ones? And what about the cities that chose to rebuild the past, like Warsaw? Is a perfect replica the same as the original? Or is it a beautiful but ultimately artificial museum of a city that no longer truly exists? Number 4. Who carried the bricks? The photos of ruined cities are overwhelming. The scale of destruction is so vast, it's easy to forget that this wasn't a natural disaster. It was man-made, and it had to be unmade by human hands. The rebuilding of entire continents was one of the greatest labor projects in history. It was done by ordinary people, often in the most desperate of circumstances. The story of reconstruction isn't just about architects' plans and government funds. It's about millions of people picking up bricks. In Germany, they had a name for the women who did this work, the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women. With a huge portion of the male population dead or in prisoner of war camps, the task of clearing the cities fell to women. They were of all ages, armed with little more than buckets, pickaxes, and their bare hands they climbed over mountains of debris. There they salvaged bricks, cleaned them of old mortar, and stacked them for reuse. It was grueling, dangerous work. But they did it. Day after day, they formed human chains, passing bricks and rubble from one person to the next. Images of these women, their faces smudged with dust, working amidst the ruins of Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg, are iconic. They became a symbol of German resilience and the will to start over. It is estimated that in Berlin alone, these women moved millions of cubic meters of rubble. This manual labor was happening all over Europe. In the Soviet Union, which suffered unimaginable destruction, the rebuilding effort was immense. Entire cities, like Stalingrad now. Volgograd had to be rebuilt from scratch. The work was done by a population exhausted by war, often facing hunger and extreme poverty. The physical rebuilding was intertwined with immense human suffering. And then there was the invisible rebuilding that had to be done. The psychological trauma of the war was immense. People had lived through years of bombing, lost their homes, lost their families. The soldiers returned from the front with what was then called shell shock or combat fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. There was very little understanding of these conditions at the time. People were expected to be strong, to get on with it. The British psychiatrist William Sargant wrote about the psychological state of Londoners after the Blitz in his book, Battle for the Mind, noting the strange mix of exhaustion, anxiety, and a certain grim determination. The trauma was buried, but it didn't go away. It shaped families for generations. The war also created the largest refugee crisis in history. Tens of millions of people were displaced. They were former prisoners of war, liberated forced laborers, and entire ethnic populations expelled from their ancestral homes as borders were redrawn. These displaced persons, or DPs, filled camps across Europe. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, was established in 1943 to deal with this massive humanitarian crisis. They provided food, shelter, and medical care. and tried to repatriate people. For many, however, there was no home to return to. Their villages were gone, or their countries were now under new, hostile regimes. The photos from these DP camps show a strange limbo, a world of temporary barracks and ration queues where people from all over Europe waited to find out where their new lives would begin. This mass movement of people permanently changed the demographic map of the continent. The effort to rebuild was not just about buildings. It was about rebuilding lives, families, and communities. It was about creating a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside over. The generation that lived through the war and then rebuilt the cities had a different perspective on life. They valued stability and security. They had seen the alternative. This greatest generation, as they are sometimes called, had a work ethic forged in the rubble. They knew what it meant to lose everything and to have to start again from zero. This collective experience, this shared memory of hardship and reconstruction, became a defining characteristic of post-war society. It fueled the desire for social safety nets, for international cooperation, and for peace, in the hope that no one would ever have to carry those bricks again. But how much of the unrecorded trauma of this generation was passed down to their children and grandchildren? We are only now beginning to understand the science of intergenerational trauma. What stories were never told? What pain was buried in the name of getting on with it? And what about the Trümmerfrauen and other laborers? Their contribution was monumental, but how many of them were truly recognized or compensated for their foundational work in creating the new Europe? We know the names of the architects, but do we know the names of the women who cleared the ground for them? Number 3, how do you pay for a new world? The physical destruction was one thing, the economic destruction was another. At the end of the war, the economies of Europe and much of Asia were in ruins. Factories were bombed out, railways were destroyed, farms were barren, national treasuries were empty, and countries were printing money to pay their debts, leading to hyperinflation. In Hungary in 1946, the inflation was so bad that prices were doubling every 15 hours. A famous photograph shows a street sweeper in Budapest sweeping up worthless banknotes in the gutter. And Europe was on the brink of total collapse. People were starving. The winter of 1946 to 47 was particularly harsh, leading to widespread famine. It was clear that Europe could not rebuild on its own. Into this crisis stepped the United States. America emerged from the war as the world's undisputed economic superpower. Its industrial base was not only intact, it had been supercharged by wartime production. Its cities had not been bombed. On June 5, 1947, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, gave a speech at Harvard University. In it, he outlined a plan for American aid to help rebuild Europe. It was a simple, pragmatic proposal. He said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." This became known as the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program (ERP). The Marshall Plan was an act of extraordinary vision. It was also an act of enlightened self-interest. American leaders understood that a desperate and unstable Europe was fertile ground for the spread of communism. The Soviet Union was consolidating its control over Eastern Europe, and there were strong communist parties in countries like Italy and France. By helping to rebuild the economies of Western Europe, the U.S. could create stable, prosperous democracies that would be reliable allies and trading partners. It was a key strategy in the emerging Cold War. The plan was massive in scale. Between 1948 and 1951, the United States provided over $13 billion in aid to 16 European countries. That's equivalent to well over $150 billion in today's money. But it wasn't just a cash handout. The aid came in the form of goods, food, fuel, raw materials, and machinery from the United States. This helped to feed people and restart factories in Europe, while also providing a huge market for American industry. It was a brilliant piece of economic statecraft. The plan required the European nations to work together to jointly decide how the aid would be distributed. This forced former enemies to cooperate, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union. The impact was dramatic. The Marshall Plan helped to stabilize European currencies, control inflation, and restore production. In West Germany, it was a key ingredient in the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. The photos of German cities in the late 1940s show rubble being cleared. The photos from a decade later show gleaming new buildings, busy streets, and shops full of goods. The Volkswagen Beetle, a symbol of this new German prosperity, started rolling off production lines. In his book, The Marshall Plan: Dawn of the Cold War, historian Ben Stile argues that the plan was the decisive moment that drew the economic line between the capitalist West and the communist East. Japan's post-war economic recovery was a different but parallel story. After its surrender, Japan was occupied by Allied forces, primarily the United States. The initial American policy was to dismantle Japan's industrial conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, and ensure the country could never again become a military power. But as the Cold War intensified and China fell to communism in 1949, this policy shifted. The US now saw Japan as a crucial ally in Asia. It began to actively support the rebuilding of the Japanese economy. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was a massive boost. Japan became the primary supply depot for the UN forces fighting in Korea. American military spending flooded the Japanese economy with cash. This, combined with Japanese industrial policy that focused on technology and exports, led to Japan's own economic miracle. The country transformed itself from a shattered, defeated nation into an economic powerhouse famous for its electronics and cars. The post-war world was essentially rebuilt on the American dollar. This established the US as the leader of the Western world and created a global economic system that persisted for decades. The destruction of the war, as terrible as it was, cleared the way for a new economic order, one that created unprecedented prosperity for many, but also cemented the deep ideological divisions of the Cold War. But what if the Marshall Plan had never happened? Would Europe have collapsed into chaos and conflict, or would it have found a different, slower path to recovery? We don't really know how much of the recovery was due to the plan itself versus the inherent resilience and hard work of the European people. And here's a more unsettling question. Was this act of generosity also a form of economic empire building, creating a world where other nations became dependent on American markets and power? Did the plan that rebuilt the world also create the very global imbalances we still struggle with today? Number two, can a city remember what it tries to forget? How does a city remember a trauma? How does a nation process a past that is filled with so much pain and destruction? After the war, there was a powerful urge to just move on, to build new buildings, create new jobs, and look to the future. Forgetting was a survival mechanism, but the past doesn't just disappear because you build over it. The ruins and the memories were still there, underneath the new concrete. The struggle over how to remember, what to remember, and what to forget became a central theme of the post-war world. Some cities chose to preserve their wounds as permanent reminders. In the heart of Berlin stands the ruin of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. Its spire was shattered in a 1943 bombing raid. After the war, there was a debate about what to do with it. Should they tear it down and build something new? In the end, they decided to leave the ruined spire exactly as it was. It was nicknamed the Hollow Tooth by Berliners. Next to it, they built a modern church and bell tower. Like Coventry Cathedral, the ruin stands as a stark, unavoidable monument to the destructive fury of war. Every day, thousands of people walk past it. It forces them to remember. It prevents the city from developing a complete amnesia about its own past. Perhaps the most powerful example of a preserved ruin is in Hiroshima. After the atomic bomb was dropped on August 6, 1945, the city was almost completely vaporized. One of the few structures left standing near the hypocenter was the building now known as the Genbaku Dome, or a bomb dome. It was the former Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall. The blast blew out its windows and roof, but its skeletal frame and dome survived. For years, it stood as a crumbling, controversial ruin. Some wanted it torn down to erase the painful memory. Others argued it must be preserved. The preservationists won. Today, the Genbaku Dome is the centerpiece of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. It is a haunting, visceral link to the moment of the bombing. It is not a beautiful monument, it is a scar. It stands as a silent witness, a universal symbol of the need to abolish nuclear weapons. But remembering wasn't always so clear-cut. In Germany, the process of coming to terms with the past was long and difficult. For the first couple of decades after the war, there was a collective silence. The focus was on the Wirtschaftswunder, on rebuilding and becoming a normal country again. People didn't talk about their own role in the conflict. This began to change with the student protest movements of the 1960s. A new generation started asking their parents and grandparents difficult questions. What did you do during the war? What did you know? This process of confronting the past is known in German as Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It has been a central and often painful part of German public life ever since. It involves education, public memorials, and an open acknowledgement of the crimes committed by the state. The memory of the war was also a political tool. In East Germany, under communist rule, the official narrative was a simple one. They were the inheritors of the anti-fascist resistance. All the guilt belonged to the capitalists in West Germany. The bombing of cities like Dresden was presented as a crime of Western imperialism. In the West, the memory was different. The focus was on their own victimhood from the bombing and their new identity as a democratic partner in the fight against Soviet totalitarianism. The before and after photos were used to tell different stories, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you were on. The writer W.G. Sebald explored this German silence about the air war in his book On the Natural History of Destruction. He noted how German literature after the war seemed unable to truly describe the horror of the firebombings, as if the experience was simply too traumatic to put into words. The physical act of rebuilding itself could be a way of forgetting. In many cities, the rush to build modern, functional buildings swept away not just the ruins, but also the last traces of a difficult history. A new, clean, modernist city had no visible scars. It allowed people to live in a present that was disconnected from the immediate past. But this also meant that the memory of what was lost, the intricate fabric of the old city, could fade away. The before photos become the only record of a world that is now completely gone, not just physically destroyed, but also erased from the daily landscape of life. So how much of our official history is shaped by what is convenient to remember rather than what actually happened? We still don't fully understand the complex psychology of how societies choose which traumas to memorialize and which to bury. Are the memorials we build today, like the one in Berlin or Hiroshima, truly for ourselves, or are they a message we are trying to send to the future? And perhaps the most difficult question, is there a point where remembering becomes an obstacle, preventing a society from moving forward and creating a new identity free from the ghosts of the past? Number one, did we rebuild cities or just walls? Look at a photograph of Berlin in the summer of 1945. It's a city of ghosts. The Reichstag is a hollowed-out shell. The Brandenburg Gate is pockmarked with bullet holes. Entire neighborhoods are just fields of brick. Now look at a map of Berlin from that same time. You'll see new lines being drawn on it, dividing the city into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. The physical rebuilding of the city hadn't even begun, but its political redivision was already underway. This raises the final, most sobering question. In the aftermath of the war, did we rebuild united communities, or did we just build stronger walls between new, opposing worlds? The war that was fought to defeat one form of totalitarianism gave rise to a new global conflict. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was a marriage of convenience. It fractured almost as soon as their common enemy was defeated. The ruins of the old world became the foundation of the new one, and this new world was split in two. This was the Cold War. Berlin became the ultimate symbol of this division. The city was located deep inside the Soviet-controlled part of Germany. The western sectors were a tiny island of capitalism in a sea of communism. The physical rebuilding of the city proceeded along 2 different ideological tracks. In West Berlin, financed by Marshall Plan Aid, a modern, consumerist, democratic city rose from the ashes. In East Berlin, the capital of the new German Democratic Republic, the rebuilding followed a Soviet model with grand Stalinist-style avenues and functional, state-owned apartment blocks. You could literally see the difference in ideology in the architecture. But this was more than a difference in building styles. It was a division of people. In the early years, Berliners could still move between the sectors. But as West Germany's economy boomed, a steady stream of people, especially young and skilled workers, fled from the east to the west. To stop this drain, the East German government made a drastic decision. On the night of August 13th, 1961, they began to build a wall. At first it was just barbed wire, then it became a concrete barrier, complete with guard towers, minefields, and armed patrols. The Berlin Wall physically sealed the division of the city, the country, and the world. The after photo of the war's destruction was replaced by a new after photo, a city literally ripped in half by a concrete scar. The wall stood as the most potent symbol of the Iron Curtain, a phrase first used by Winston Churchill in a 1946 speech to describe the division of Europe. The rebuilding of the world after 1945 was, in many ways, the building of these two opposing camps. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe into a bloc of capitalist democracies allied with the United States through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, a military alliance formed in 1949. In response, the Soviet Union consolidated its control over Eastern Europe, creating a bloc of communist satellite states bound together by the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance. Money, the materials, the political systems that were used to reconstruct the shattered cities also served to harden this new global divide. Even the memory of the war was rebuilt differently on each side. In the West, it was remembered as a victory for democracy over tyranny. In the East, it was remembered as a victory for communism over fascism. The before and after photos were interpreted through these competing lenses. Was the destruction of Dresden a necessary act to defeat a terrible regime? Or was it a war crime committed by capitalist bombers? The answer depended on which side of the wall you were on. The war had been fought by a grand alliance, but the peace was a divided one. The hope for a new world of cooperation, embodied in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, quickly gave way to a reality of suspicion, proxy wars, and a terrifying nuclear arms race. The technology of destruction that had been perfected to end the war, the atomic bomb, now became the central feature of this new peace. It was a peace maintained by the threat of mutual assured destruction. The world had been rebuilt, yes, but on a geological fault line. The prosperity and stability that many enjoyed in the post-war decades existed under the constant shadow of a potential apocalypse. The new buildings were strong, but the peace was fragile. The world had been rebuilt, but it was a house divided against itself. And so we are left with the final uncomfortable questions. Did the very act of rebuilding to prevent future conflicts actually create the conditions for a new, colder, and potentially even more dangerous kind of war? In our rush to create order and stability from the chaos of 1945, did we simply trade one set of walls for another? And as we look at the photos of those rebuilt cities gleaming and whole once more, we must ask what invisible divisions, what new walls were we building into their very foundations?